Welcome to another module. Now that we had a look at how we can transform elements, let's have a look at how we can actually animate elements. In this module, we'll dive into transitions and animations, and you'll learn what the difference is and when to use which. So let's get started. Let's start with transitions. Transitions are kind of built-in animations, you could say. Transitions are added by adding one property, transition, and specifying which other property, like the opacity or the position of an element, should be watched and should be animated if it changes. So here's an example. We got a box, and we actually want to move that towards us with transform and translate set, let's say. Then we could animate that change. We tell the transition property, and we'll apply it in practice in a second, which properties to change, if there should be a delay, how it should animate it, so over which time, and how fast it should move through the time. So should it start fast and end slow, start slow and end fast? These are all things we can define. Now that's of course just the theory. Let's dive into this in a concrete example. In our main.css file, we got that modal selector. Now this is obviously responsible for that modal we got on our page. Right now, we're always using display none to not show it. Let's actually change this, and let's make sure we don't show it by adding opacity 0 instead. Opacity 0 simply makes it invisible. The difference is it's now still part of the document flow, and opacity, unlike display, is a property we can watch with a so-called transition. A list with properties you can watch can be found in the last lecture of this module, by the way. So opacity 0 is how I now want to hide the modal. Let's also add a transformation, and let's use translate y to move it on the y-axis with -3 rem as a value. So this will move the element up by 3 rem. Now, you might ask, why am I doing this? We're not seeing it anyways. Well, you'll see why. And of course, you could also move the element up with top, but transform is what you should use if you plan on animating that movement, because it is watchable with transition and it's hardware accelerated. It's awesome for animations, or for transitions to be precise. So let's add these two properties to modal. Now the idea is that we change these two properties with JavaScript. You remember, earlier in this course, we added code to show the modal when we click on select a plan by simply adding that open class. Now in that open class, if we have a look at this again, we can find it in the shared CSS file, we set display block to important. Now this doesn't really matter anymore, because right now for the modal at least, we don't use the display value anymore, but we can also still leave it. More importantly, what I want to do here is, I want to set the opacity to 1 here, and use transform with translate y, and set it to 0. Now this simply sets it back to its original position as defined in the document flow. So when we open the modal, it should be moved to that place. Now just as with block, we need to add important to all of these to override the defaults though. So let's save all of that. Let's go back to our project and reload. And now if I click choose plan, we see the modal again. Just as before, there's no animation or anything like that at all. But now we can set up a so-called transition. For this, we go to the main.css file and we add a new property anywhere in that list of properties, as always, which is named transition. Now the transition property is able to take a couple of values. To be precise, you can define up to 4 values here, a list of 4 values. The first one is absolutely required, and that is which property do you want to watch. You can watch all with the all keyword, then the transition will be played whenever a transitionable property changes. But here, I could also enter opacity and transform as values. So 2 values separated with a comma in this case. If you have more than 1 value, you need to separate them with a comma. You then also define the duration over which you want to play an animation when one of these properties changes, or when a property changes. And you define that duration directly after the property you're watching. So let's say 0.5 seconds after opacity. By the way, instead of 0.5s for seconds. You could also write 500 milliseconds. This is also supported. So you can use S for seconds or ms for milliseconds. And let's also transform this over, let's say, 500 milliseconds too. Maybe it becomes visible faster though, maybe 200 milliseconds. So please note that you set different durations for the different properties you're transitioning over. Of course, if you just want to animate one, you would just animate one by simply removing the second one. If you animate more than one, you need to separate the lists with commas though. So this is now defining what we animate and over which time we want to animate or transition to that new value. And CSS will automatically interpolate the value you're coming from, so opacity 0, translate -3 rem, to the value you're going to, so opacity 1, translate y 0. With that, we can already save this and now reload our page. And now if I click choose plan, you actually see there's a nice animation. And there also is the animation if I close it, because it automatically reverses this or plays it in the other direction, so to say. In the end, what it does is it simply transitions smoothly from your starting value to your end value. And this is a very easy way of adding a nice looking animation. Now you can add more than just a what and over which duration. You can also add a timing function, which allows you how fast it should go through that duration. It'll always take 200 milliseconds, but you can tell it to start fast and end slow with ease out. Now it will become slower towards the end. Or with ease in, for example, it'll start faster. I'll dive deeper into timing functions in a second, by the way. So let's use ease out here for the opacity and also for the transformation, so for translate in the end, though this will animate anything you transform, by the way. You can't really filter for just translations here. So now with that, if we reload and I choose plan, not sure if you see it, but actually it's now ending slower than it starts. Now last but not least, you can also set a delay. You simply add a fourth value like 1 second. This would mean it will start 1 second before it starts with that transition. So now if I click the button, nothing happens for 1 second, and then it plays this animation. For some use cases, this can also be helpful. In this case here, it isn't, so let's get rid of it. This is how you use transitions. You define what you want to watch, over which duration you want to animate to that new value, and how that duration should be used. Let's have a look at that strange timing function thing we saw in the last lecture. We can think of the timing or the duration of the transition as a function. At the beginning, no time passed, and the transition also has a completion state of 0%. But as we play the animation, it transitions from 0% completion to 100% over the given time. And for this specific function here, it temporarily even has a higher completion than the end completion. This is also possible. You could have functions where you, for example, want to change the scale of an element, and in between, you actually have a bigger scale than at the end to have a bumping effect. This is something you can easily build with CSS animations, something I'll dive in later. Now regarding the transition timing functions, if you Google for CSS timing functions, you'll find a really helpful site, Easing Functions cheat sheet, easings.net, and there you find a lot of values or timing functions, and if you hover over them, there's also a demo animation playing showing you how this actually will look like. So for example, this one, ease in cubic, starts really slow and finishes fast. If you click on one of them, it also shows you a code for this. And that's interesting. Thus far we used ease out, ease in. Actually, there also is linear and this helpful cubic Bézier function. This allows you to enter your own timing function with 4 parameters defining that function. This essentially defines a function of time and completion. And sites like this are really great to create such a timing function. So if we copy that, for example, and we insert this for our transform transition of the modal, called cubic Bézier with these values. Now if we go back to our project and reload the page, and I click choose plan, now you see it starts very slow and then finishes suddenly. Even better, in the Chrome developer tools, if you inspect your modal here, and you inspect the properties, you can see that timing function here, and there's this button. You can find that strange button next to each timing function, to any timing function you have. If you click it, you can actually create your timing function in the Chrome developer tools by playing with these handles. Generally, the steeper it's at the beginning, the faster it starts, and the slower it ends, so to say. So you can play around with that and create really powerful timing function. You always get a preview at the top here, by the way. And this can be nice to find out how to work with timing functions to create that visual transition effect you want to have. Now, with the basics of transitions set, let's transition the backdrop too. Now there we'll face a special case which I want to show you. The backdrop, which is selected with this backdrop class selector, still is shown by setting display none to display block. And this happens because we add the open class to the backdrop too when we select a plan, for example. Now the problem we face is that in that open class, we obviously change the opacity and display to block. And now we could think that we simply go to the backdrop and also don't use display none to hide it, but opacity 0 instead. Then we could add a transition where we watch the opacity, and maybe over 200 milliseconds, or 0.2 seconds, which of course is the same value, we animate with a linear timing function, so that we always move at the same speed. This is an approach we could take. If we now reload the page, we notice that we can't click Choose Plan anymore. Now, do you know why that happens? This happens because the backdrop now only is invisible. It's not there. Now, since it has a set index of 100, it's actually in front of all the other elements, even though we can't see it. That is why we can't interact with any element on our page. Clearly, an awful user experience. Now, of course, the fix is easy, right? We got our open CSS class selector here, and we still set display block there. So all we gotta do is go to that backdrop again, and besides using the opacity, we can use display none together with the opacity. With that, we really remove it from the document flow, and therefore, if we reload, we can interact again. However, if you watch closely, you might notice that the backdrop isn't really animated. This becomes even clearer if we temporarily increase that to 2 seconds of a duration. Now, if we go back and click this plan, this doesn't look like a 2-second transition to me. The reason for this is some special behavior. If you change display, first of all, you can't transition that display change, so watching display won't work. And second of all, if you change the display from none to something else, or the other way around, then your transition isn't going to kick off even if you're also changing some other property which normally would be animatable or transitionable. This is super important to keep in mind. Now, if you still want to ensure that this works in this case, you would have to use some hacky workaround where in JavaScript, you actually first of all set the backdrop style to block. Backdrop style display is set to block. And also the other way around for closing it. So in all occasions where we actually remove the open class, we set that to none. And that alone isn't enough. So this isn't all we have to do. Instead, we now also have to delay the start of the code where we add the open class. We can do this with the JavaScript set timeout method. There we pass a function which is executed after a given timeout, which can be very short, like 10 milliseconds. The 10 as a second argument means 10 milliseconds. So after 10 milliseconds, this function gets executed, and there we actually should attach that open class. So now we can copy that and also wrap that backdrop remove listener with it. So here we want to remove that after 10 milliseconds. And what this does is it ensures that we first of all set display to none or block, whatever we need. And then as a second step, we change that. So we add this class or remove it. This ensures that CSS doesn't change all the properties in one step and therefore omits the transition, but that it actually first of all changes the display, which is the crucial part, and then it changes the other properties and hence also plays our transition. So let's also add it up here where we have backdrop class list add open. And with these changes in place, now we should actually be able to reload our page. And now we see a nice transition here. Now, of course, that's way too slow. So now we can speed that up to not use 2 seconds, but 0.2 seconds for that opacity transition. And now we got a transition on the backdrop too. Definitely a bit hacky, but a way of making this work if you need such a behavior. And I wanted to share this with you for that reason. One thing you might notice, for closing the backdrop, it disappears instantly because I have an error in my code. For closing, we of course first of all want to remove that open class. And then once that is finished, we want to set display to none. This has one important implication. For that closing function, the timeout, the delay for which we want to wait, has to match the delay of your transition, or the duration of your transition, I should say. So since our transition takes 200 milliseconds, here, that opacity transition on the backdrop, we need to execute that function which removes the element from the document flow by setting display to none after these 200 milliseconds. And that, of course, is a bit inconvenient because this means whenever you change the duration here on your transition property, you also need to change it in your JavaScript code. This is still a workaround you can use. Often, thankfully, you don't have a setup where you require this behavior. If you do require it, keep this approach in mind. With these changes added, now we can reload, and now we got a smooth transition for the backdrop as well for both cases, adding and removing it. So this now is how we can make transitions work under all circumstances. We had a detailed look at CSS transitions, which make it very easy to animate the transition of a CSS property from one value to another. Now let's have a look at CSS animations. We can think of them as CSS transitions ++. So it's still about animating things, but with way more control over the animation. So if we have a block and we want to move to a bigger block and maybe with a different color, we can of course use a transition. But if we want more control, like some in-between step, CSS animations are really what we're looking for. In CSS animations, we define so-called keyframes, and we get full control what the style of an element is at a given point of time. Now let's see how that works. For this, I'm back in our project, and I want to animate that Start Hosting Call to Action button in the top right corner here. Now that button's style is defined in the shared CSS file. We can search for CTA here to find our main nav CTA link here. And I want to play an animation on that button. Right when the page loads, I want it to wiggle around. So to rotate a bit up or rotate a bit down. Now with a transition, that's hard to do because it should, well, wiggle. It should move in both directions and it should also stop after a given time. But until this, it should just, well, iterate between moving up, moving down. Transition is not really what we're looking for in this case. An animation is what we need. And an animation always starts with you defining some keyframes. These are the steps of the animation you want to go through. You define keyframes in a CSS file by using @keyframes. So just as you used @media and so on before, @keyframes is a special expression. You define a set of keyframes here, which you can later use in a CSS animation. And you have to give that set a name. The name is totally up to you. Can be wiggle, for example. Now you then add curly braces, and in there, the most basic animation simply has a from value. So you add the from keyword, and then curly braces, and then the to keyword. This essentially allows you to define two keyframes, the starting state and the ending state. We'll later dive into how you can add more keyframes. Now, I want this to rotate. So let's add a transform property here, and then maybe rotate set 0. This is where I want to start. So I want to start with the rotation it has initially, which is not rotated at all. Please note that there is no CSS selector in here, just a CSS property. This property will later be applied to any element which receives that set of keyframes as an animation. The target state maybe is that we have a transformation of, let's say, rotate set of 10 degrees, so moved up a little bit. Now important, you can of course use any CSS property here, not just transform. You can also change the text color with color, or the background, or whatever you want to do. Not every property is animatable, but you can still change it. It might just jump to the next value immediately. Because what happens behind the scenes is that for a CSS animation, CSS will still automatically generate smooth transitions between your starting and target value. You just have more control about the different in-between states, something I'll come back to, and of course it's way easier to define like 5 different properties that should be animated than it is with transitions. Here you simply add them one after each other. So here we got a simple animation though. Just one property which we change and just 2 states, starting and end state. Now with that keyframe set defined, let's use it as an animation. And please note that we say nothing about the duration of the animation here, just where we want to start and end. So let's move up then, and let's find our navigation items. Here we got the call to action button. Now add a new selector, and for main nav item CTA, so only in the main navigation for the call to action button, I want to add that animation by adding the animation property. First of all, we then reference the name of the keyframes we want to play, wiggle in our case, so the name we define for that keyframe set. And then we define the duration, like 200 milliseconds. We can also add a delay, and since this will actually play right from the time we load the page, a delay of 3 seconds might not be too bad, to give the user some time to orientate himself. Of course, you can also use JavaScript to dynamically add an animation so that it only plays when a certain event happens. Whenever useful value you can specify here are the animation iterations, maybe 8. This means it will play the animation 8 times after it starts. You also can then specify the direction, which simply means after one iteration, does it snap back to the starting state and start the next iteration, or does it actually alternate and move back to the starting state? So we can specify alternate here in this case. With that, if we save that, we can reload our page, and now after 3 seconds, we actually see that our button starts wiggling here. Now this didn't look like 8 times, because the alternate swing actually also counts as an iteration. So we got 4 iterations in each direction. Besides alternate, you also got reverse. Let's see what this does if we now reload. Here, after 3 seconds, we can see now it's way more bumpy, because now what it actually does is it plays the keyframes in reverse. So it starts with the end state and then moves back. And you also got alternate reverse. I think alternate looks the best here though. One interesting other value you can set for animations is the fill state. Now the fill state simply defines should the properties set during the animation, so in our case the transform property and its value, should that be kept when the animation is finished or not? The default is that it's not keeping that. You can also decide that you'd want to keep the starting state, which can differ from your normal element state, by the way. Here it's the same, but of course you can have an element where you add an animation and the starting state is, for example, that it has a blue background color, so it immediately starts the animation with that. But by default, the element could have a green background color. So then the starting state of the animation would differ from the default state of the element. Anyways, you can tell the animation or CSS which values to keep with the fill state, which is added as another value to that animation shorthand here. And that can be forwards to tell it to keep the final result. Let me show you what this means. Now if I reload, you will see that the animation plays. And it actually finishes with nothing because we alternate. But if we remove alternate, you will see that it actually will finish in a rotated state. Because now it has this bumpy look, but it actually finishes rotated because we specified forwards, which tells it, please keep the final property and values you have in the last keyframe here. If you use backwards, it'll keep the setup of the starting state. Now let me show you what I mean. If we set the starting state to -10 degrees, then it's actually a different state than the default state of the element, which of course is no rotation. So if I now set this to backwards and we reload, you'll see it starts in this state already and then it starts wiggling and it ends in the final normal state. You can also use both, in which case it will start with that first keyframe already, and then will end with the value of the last keyframe. Now, the most common use case is forwards actually, because often you have animations where you want to ensure that you finish in a certain state and that you then keep that state. So now with forward set, we start in the normal state, then we start wiggling around, and then we have our end state. Now here for the call to action button, I actually want to have none, so we can set none here. We don't have to do that though, none is the default value. So that's a basic animation. Thus far we only use 2 keyframes. The cool thing about animations is that we can use more than 2 though. So let's do that in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we added a basic animation, and I hope these values are all clear. Let's now add another keyframe though. And for that, I'll generally change the notation. Instead of from and to, we can also use percentage values here. We have 0% and 100% then. That's the same as from and to. But now we can add as many in-between steps as we want, simply by adding another block, for example with 50%. But you can also use 10, 15, whatever you need. And now you can define which state your animation should have when it's halfway done. So this is now where I will set transform to rotate set minus 10 degree. So now I'll actually start at 0, then halfway through the animation will be at 50%, and by the end will be at 100%. Now we got 3 keyframes and therefore way more control over our animation. Now if we go back to our animation property, where we added to an element, we still have wiggle, we still maybe have that duration, maybe we increased it a bit so that we can see that animation a bit better. We still have the delay and the duration count maybe, so let's now save this and look what that yields. Now, you see we have a way better wiggle effect, because now we have that in-between step, which actually looks way better than using that alternate mode. We can still use alternate here, of course. We can still add alternate as a value, but this will actually lead to a strange look here, because we're already controlling the full animation perfectly. So now here it will actually play this strange thing, because it moves through the entire animation and then plays it back, which looks ugly in our case. One thing that's good to know is that you can still add a timing function though. You can still add ease out. And by the way, the order of these values here doesn't really matter, except for duration and delay. Since both use seconds or milliseconds, here the duration should come first. But back to the timing function. Isn't it strange to specify ease out or any other timing function if you have perfect control over the way the animation plays? Well, the timing function simply is there to decide how the movement between the keyframes should be animated. Because if you go from transform rotate set 0 to transform rotate set minus 10 degree, this change of course has to be animated. And actually this works exactly as the transition did. So here it will simply transition from 0 to minus 10 degree. And that transition happens over half the time of your animation, but that time there between these 2 keyframes, this is now affected by the timing function. You can specify linear or any other timing function you want, like ease out in our case here. So with that, if we reload, we might not even see a big difference here, because that's really hard to spot, but now this is actually animating with the ease out timing function between our keyframe steps. Now that we had a look at the basics of animations, let's create one for another part of our page. On the customers page, let's make sure we can actually flip a customer if we hover over him. For that, I'll go to my customers CSS file, and first of all, I'll create the keyframes for the animation, just as we learned it. That's always the first step. So we use add keyframes to create our keyframes set, and I'll name it flip customer, or whichever name you want to assign to that animation. Then here, I want to use 3 keyframes, and of course you can tweak this just as you desire. I want to use transform again, As you saw, you often use transform when you play around with animations or transitions, simply because transitions and animations often are about moving things. And here, I want to rotate the customer on the y-axis, but start at 0. Now I will also add a second keyframe and transform my rotation again, but now I want to transform to, let's say, 160 degrees. So I want to completely flip the customer, and this is almost at the point where we flipped it half. With 180 degree, we would see the backside of the customer perfectly, but I want to play this a little bit slower. So at 50% of the animation, we didn't entirely complete half the flip yet. But then at 100%, I of course want to complete the flip, and I do so by adding transform rotate Y here, 360 degrees. Now with that, we got the keyframe set. And now, of course, we just need to add it somewhere. And to add it somewhere, I'll go up to my customers and I'll actually create a new selector. Our customers have an ID. Customer 1 has an ID of customer 1. So I'll use that ID selector here. Maybe here, doesn't matter. Customer 1, and listen to a hover, or use the hover pseudo selector. But then I actually want to animate a nested element. I want to animate the image container. I want to flip the image, not the entire customer. So there, I'll target testimonial image container. So whenever I hover over the customer block, then I want to adjust the style for the image container. And here I want to play my animation, flip customer, that's the keyframe set we just added, over 1 second, let's say, maybe with a ease out timing function, and I want to keep the ending state with forwards. Now if we save that and we reload the page, you can already see it. If we hover over the customer, it flips. But the skewness is messed up, as you can see. So this is something we can fix by going down to our keyframes again, and now by animating more than one property. I also want to animate the skewness, and since this also is a transform value, I'll simply add the skew function here. And now it's the 20 degrees by which I skew the container. This now stays constant in all my keyframes because I never want to change the skewness. Though if you want to create a really fancy effect, play around with that too, and you'll probably get a crazy animation. Now with that, let's go back and let's reload the page. And now actually the skewness is kept when we rotate that image. Only of customer 1, by the way, because we only added the effect there. Now on a mobile device, by the way, you don't see this. You have to click on it to trigger that and then click somewhere else, because there is no hovering on mobile devices, of course. This is working the way I want it to work. And it shows that, of course, you can animate more than one property value pair. Here we're animating 2, and we're even keeping 1 constant to ensure that we don't mess up our skewness in this case. We're almost done with this module. You learned a lot about CSS animations. Now, when using animations, there actually is a cool extra feature you can use in JavaScript. You can listen to certain events connected to your animations. Let's connect an event to our call to action button. We do that by going into our JavaScript code, and let's first of all get access to that button. So CTA button maybe. We get access by using the document query selector again. And keep in mind, our button has a class of main nav item CTA. So let's use that class as a selector. We only got one button, so we'll only select this element here. Now we can add an event listener, as we already did it for a click event, for example. So at the end of this JavaScript file, the position doesn't matter though, I'll add an event listener again. And now the event I can listen to, of course, is a click, but regarding animations, we got 3 interesting animations. The first one is animation start. We can then execute a function, and here I simply want to console log animation started, and actually we receive an argument in this function, an event object with additional information about that event. So let's also print this. Console log is a helpful function which allows us to output something in the developer console. Let's register 2 other event listeners. The first other is animation end, And the third one is animation iteration. I'll adjust my log messages to animation ended and animation iteration. With that, let's save all of that. Let's go back to our page and open that JavaScript console in the developer tools. And let's reload the page. And now you can see we get a couple of logs here on the right. We got animation started, then we got a log for each iteration, and we got animation ended. And if you inspect the animation event, you find the animation name which was played, so your keyframe set essentially, and a couple of helpful properties like which element was animated and a timestamp. For each iteration, you find that same information, but also useful things like the elapsed time. Now, as you see, the elapsed time, of course, increases by the same amount for each iteration step. This can be super useful if you want to time something in your JavaScript code. For example, if you want to start something once the animation ended, because you got this hook here too, of course. After the full time of the animation, this is what gets fired. By the way, if you're wondering why this is 3.2 seconds, if we specified 400 milliseconds, we repeat it 8 times. So this is how we end up with the 3.2 seconds at the end. So the JavaScript event listeners can be really useful, and I definitely wanted to add them to this module here, even though it's a CSS course. So that's it for the module. We had a look at CSS animations, and you learned that keyframes are an important part of CSS animations. You learned that you can define all animation steps with keyframes, either with from and to, or with detailed percentage values. I also mentioned that you can animate as many properties and values as you want, and also important to know, these properties can also differ between the different steps. You can animate whatever you want. Some properties won't be animatable though, but there they will just snap to the next value. If you then define a timing function on the animation, this timing function will affect how the values are transitioned between the keyframes defined by you. Now that already leads us to the animation property. There you define which keyframe set should be played and over which duration it should be played. You can optionally add a delay, and you can define how often the animation should be repeated. If you don't set an iteration count, it will be played only once. If you got multiple iterations, you can also define if they should alternate or always start at the beginning again. With animation fill mode, you can also decide if the properties of the last keyframe should be kept after the animation, or if the properties of the first keyframe should be applied before the animation starts already. And finally, you also saw that you can listen to animation events with the help of JavaScript.